Hello, I'm Dell from the Detailers Guild podcast, and I'm here today with another solo effort, if you will. Once again, the theme here today is music. I was thinking, what should I talk about today? And it occurred to me that, you know what, maybe I might give a little history, if you will, on one of my favorite bands. It just so happens that this is a band that Dean also enjoys as well, and that would be the Gap Band. The Gap Band was an American R&B and funk group that rose to fame during the 1970s and 80s. The band consisted of three brothers, Charlie, Ronnie, and Robert Wilson, and it was named after the streets, Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, in the historic Greenwood neighborhood in the brothers' hometown of Tulsa, Oklahoma. After 43 years together, they retired in 2010. This is a quote that I give you from Wikipedia here, but I say this to kind of give a professional sounding synopsis of the band. But what I can tell you from a personal level is they were a group that I grew up listening to. The funny thing is, they had songs that were of the funk era because that's kind of where they came from originally. They started off in the early 70s, 1974 to be exact, and they went on till 2010. Now, by 2010, their popularity had waned as far as new output was concerned, but their classic era was really during the 80s. That's where they really popped off. For anyone who is a person who listens to hip-hop or modern R&B or rap, they may not know the songs of the Gap Band because maybe they're too young to know them, but they will know of the Gap Band's influence, and that being the fact that they are one of the most sampled bands, funk bands I should say, to come out. Them along with Kool and the Gang, and then you also had James Brown was another one who was heavily sampled. Now, to give a brief history, the early years of the Gap Band, the band received their first big break by being up a backup band for fellow Oklahoman Leon Russell back in 1974. And when they started off, they were really a hardcore funk band at the time. Their first album came out in 1974, and that was called Magician's Holiday. They also came out with an album that was self-titled in 1977, just simply titled The Gap Band. Now, just to clear anything up for those of you who are familiar with the Gap Band, they also put out a 1979 album that was also self-titled. So there's two Gap Band albums, 2 years apart, that were named The Gap Band. That being said, the early 70s, the band started out. They put out a few albums, but they weren't necessarily commercially successful, although they had what you could call a cult following. Their success came really with two tracks from 1979. This was also from their self-titled track, but this was the second self-titled track, album I should say, from 1979 called The Gap Band. And they had two top 10 hits, I'm in Love and Shake. They also had I Don't Believe You Want to Get Up and Dance from The Gap Band too. Now, that one didn't hit the Hot 100, but it did soar to number 4 in the R&B charts, and that album went gold. They kind of had more of like a P-Funk sound to them at the time, which was really catchy at the time. And you know what? They had a song called Steppin' Out, which was also an R&B top 10. Now, the thing with them is they were a group that at the time that they were big, they didn't necessarily have a whole lot of crossover success in terms of charting. However, in the R&B charts, they were burning it up. And see, this is one of the things, I think in a later episode we will talk music history because there's a lot to talk about there. This is an example that back in the day, there were artists out there that you may well know now who you may wonder why they never had the success that you would think that they had because you've heard of them. But the thing is, back in the day, if you had an R&B act, especially a black R&B act at the time, there was a separate category between your R&B hits and having crossover success. Whereas now, it's not really labeled so much that way, but back in the day, you could have an album that would be big in the black community, let's just say, but overall wouldn't necessarily score, even though the song may be immensely popular. There were things that were different at that time, and going back even further, where unfortunately at that time, it was a lot harder to attain crossover success as a black artist if you sang R&B music, because R&B music at the time did not necessarily go over crossover wise as well as it does now. Just as a little historical tidbit here, this kind of goes to show you how messed up society was back then compared to now, because you could have an artist, say like a Ray Charles or something like that, who would have a big song that everybody would like, but if you went to the record store, you would find the Ray Charles record. But if you look at some of the early releases for some of these artists, you'll notice that on their album cover, they will have a generic picture on the cover, or it may have a cover of people dancing or something like that, but they didn't show the artist. And as silly as this may sound by today's standards, the reason for that was because back in the day, a lot of these record executives and whatnot felt as if showing a black artist, even though you heard the song and you knew that the artist was black, for some reason they felt that having a black artist represent themselves on their album cover would somehow offend the public. So as a way of fooling the public, or the ones who had that backward mentality at the time, to say, okay, you know what, we don't like these people, but we'll listen to their music, would have an artist like a Ray Charles or a Little Stevie Wonder. And I say Little Stevie Wonder because this is back when he was really small, although he had actually came in afterwards where they actually did feature him on the cover. But you would have artists prior to Motown where if they were to have a hit, it would either be the case that they would have to have a generic cover in order for it to sell, or what they would do is they would take an artist who would put out a song, and that artist would turn around and sing the song, and the song would have limited success, but then they would have that song covered by a white artist, and that song would suddenly take off. And there's many examples of this back in the day, whether we look at Hound Dog from Elvis Presley or others, where the song was originally written and performed by a black artist, but because of the way the times were, they weren't able to actually deem the success from this album, and it ended up being that it was a white artist who was able to have it take off. All that being said, that's for another episode, but that's a little bit of an excerpt there of history. But getting back to the Gap Band here, this was one of those things where they were still stuck in the tail ends of that era, so they had a lot of R&B hits, but R&B had not yet become mainstream. So they had a lot of hits there. Now they had probably, I would say, in all honesty, I would say they had about a 5 to 6 year run of chart toppers. And that, for anyone who is a real fan of the band, this is the time period in which they remember. So for me, they were a very influential group, and a lot of their songs, whether it be Burn Rubber on Me, or Humpin', or Early in the Morning, or You Drop a Bomb on Me, or my personal favorite, Outstanding, these were tracks that forever remind me of my youth. This is the reason why I think music is really important. This is something that I think that you can agree yourself that it doesn't matter what the name of the group is or what genre the group is, we can all find artists out there who this happens to be the case, where whether it be a Led Zeppelin or a Pink Floyd or Randy Travis or whoever the case is, you can remember albums from these artists and know that this was basically a slice of life for you. That's the thing that makes music amazing. And this was just an example of one group that I really enjoyed. And moving forward, we will talk about more groups. I just wanted to talk about the Gap Band a little bit today and kind of weaved in some musical history there as well, because of the fact that it just so happens that the Gap Band happens to be a band that both Dean and I enjoy. And it was actually one of our, when we first met up as friends, this was one of our first common talking points. So I just thought it would be appropriate to bring that up and kind of talk about that a little bit. And I hope you enjoyed listening today. And what we're going to do is we're going to have more episodes like this where we're going to talk about different groups. And they're not all going to be R&B. Some will be rock, because I loved rock and roll music as well. Some will be jazz. And some will just be talking about music in general. But just kind of give you a little tidbit and what I think about it and whatnot. I hope you enjoyed listening to it today. I look forward to you hearing more. And till next week, I say goodbye. Hi, I'm Dell from the Detailers Guild, and I thank you for listening to my program today. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to check out my radio shows that I normally broadcast, you can go to my Mixcloud page at mixcloud.com/DJ DELL523, and the name of my show is The Urban Flow. Thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes coming soon.